Hello, classical rhetoric students. Professor Stevenson here, and we are definitely climbing this mountain that is a session. We are near the top and about to go down. I am a trail runner and a hiker, so that is my best metaphor. But I think as most of you are all probably either starting on or well knee deep in Cicero, you know it's kind of a tough read in the dialogues. But after Cicero, you have Quintilian, which is much nicer and easier to get to. So stay the course, and we are so very, very close to finishing up this semester, and you all have done a fantastic job thus far. This week, I could tell Aristotle was pretty interesting to most of you all. Some of you commented that you feel like you've known that you've been kind of immersed in Aristotle's concepts for a really long time, and now that you're able to actually read them in person, they become a lot clearer. And some of you who are teaching them found this really helpful to kind of go through what he says about rhetoric. So let's get into it. The first question is, how is rhetoric useful? And so Dustin had a really great answer here. He says, for Aristotle, rhetoric is an art and not merely the subject matter of persuasion. I think that's the key, or that's one key to Aristotle, is he gives rhetoric a stuff in a lot of ways, there's a little bit more of a curriculum for rhetoric here. We saw it kind of like the curriculum for rhetoric in Isocrates kind of play out, but here it's so clear here in the rhetoric. But we start to see that it's an art that can be translated to different subjects, as opposed to only a subject in and of itself, if that makes sense. So persuasion isn't persuasion for its own sake. It can be applied to different fields, which is, for me, something I always go through. Like, I teach freshman composition all the time, and that's when we get to the first couple of weeks when we're really kind of like, what is rhetoric and what is writing and how can we apply all this stuff? We talk about Aristotle's available means of persuasion, and we discuss like how scientists, right, are famously bad at communicating their ideas, and that at least in the field of rhetoric and composition, we have technical and professional communication, technical and professional writers. We have a whole field that helps scientists and engineers and people help communicate their ideas rhetorically. So going back to Dustin, he says, being an art, rhetoric is a framework that may be drawn on to persuade an audience of the probable truth of a rhetorician's position. Rhetoric, unlike dialectic, which seeks to defend positions with an interlocutor, and instead takes a pragmatic role of defense and attack in front of an audience. So that's the other thing, is from Plato we get philosophy, right? And philosophy is dialectic. One of the ways to get at philosophical ideas is through dialectic, whereas rhetoric is about the public, and no, I wouldn't say performance insofar as like acting, but it is a lot, and we get a lot of that in Aristotle. It is a lot about how a writer, an author, a speech maker can persuade a public in person. A skilled rhetorician is able to draw on their experience in rhetoric's formulations and create new and appropriate arguments. The rhetorical formations draw on common knowledge and experience of the audience and are adapted to be the most persuasive. So this is where we get the commonplaces and the topoi, right? This is obviously useful for prosecution and defense in law settings, rhetoric would also be appropriate for other speeches given in front of audience or the means of persuasion, such as deliberative speeches or epidictic speeches. For Aristotle, rhetorical skill developed for persuasive speeches is appropriate, 1, because true and right speeches are naturally stronger than their counterpart, and their defeat is due to a poor speaker. 2, because a knowledgeable person on the subject may not be convincing because of their inability to construct proofs and arguments from common knowledge. 3, to understand both sides of an argument in order to refute someone arguing for an immoral position. And 4, because a person should have the means to defend themselves through good rhetoric, and even though a risk of moral misuse of the skill is present. So he does here. Aristotle kind of develops like some specific uses of rhetoric that he thinks are appropriate, and he goes through. So Dustin kind of outlines them. Gabriella also answers this really well. She says, rhetoric, it is suggested, brings a connection between orator and audience. Orators, to use rhetoric effectively, must know their audience and use skills to reach the specific groups that came their way. So that's another big thing that we get from Aristotle, is how he conceives of audience as a living thing, as people, as like we know that from modern political dialogue, but audiences in sort of the deliberative body or constituents, they are people with lives and cares of their own, and Aristotle kind of acknowledges that. They had to their hearers, quote, into the they had to their hearers, quote, into the corresponding frame of mind before effectively reaching them through rhetoric. Rhetoric is so useful to convince people to do things, look into things, and discovering truth and human connection. In order to be effective, an orator must analyze their craft and style and language use, arrange the components adequately, and know a means of actually persuading the audience. It's a lengthy process that requires careful planning and clarity, but it has the power to make all the difference in a society. So the one thing to remember about Aristotle, too, is that he's still a student of Plato. So in a lot of ways, he finds room for rhetoric in the same way that kind of Plato finds room for rhetoric by the end of his career in the Phaedrus, is that rhetoric, we need rhetoric when there is, where universal truth isn't available. So in these instances, so even though Aristotle has this whole huge treatise on rhetoric, he's still on Plato's side with universal truth. Aristotle is often thought to blend the idea of Isocrates and Plato. Do you see this happening? Oh gosh, I didn't write down whose answer this is. So this one came from someone, and I apologize for that. Sorry, when I record these, I don't have two screens up, so I literally have my printed notes. And I did not record this person's name. So this person said, yes, it's Isocrates. Having said that, I wonder if I allow myself to be prejudiced in favor of Aristotle due to my impression that he was compassionate about doing good for his audience, while Plato impressed me as mostly caring about doing good for himself. Nevertheless, I noticed that just as arete was the core of Isocrates' teaching, the same concept of virtue was addressed in rhetoric, such as the definition of a sophist being a man possessing a moral purpose. A belief in the importance of kairos was central to Isocrates, and Aristotle reflected the same conviction when he addressed how rhetors must be cognizant of the impression they make on their audience beliefs regarding the rhetor's truthfulness, knowledge, and virtue, and in their ability to put the audience in the proper frame of mind for agreeing with the rhetor's compelling oratory skill. So that I think Plato's easier to do here. Isocrates is a little bit more difficult, but Plato was into dialectic, believed universal truth. And we see that in Aristotle, right? Even though there's a lot of explanation on rhetoric, again, it's just that because it's in the instances where we don't have access to universal truth. So it's in the how is rhetoric useful thing. So it's in those like 4 instances. So because true and right speeches are naturally stronger than their counterpart, and their defeat is due to a poor speaker, right? That's one of the reasons. So I could see Plato being like, well, yes, we can train people to be strong speakers because we don't want people to confuse we don't want laymen, the people who don't have access to universal truth, to be confused here. So we want to help train speakers. Like, yes, we can be in that business. And the other one, because a knowledgeable person on a subject may not be convincing because of their inability to construct proofs and arguments from common knowledge. So again, a skill set that can help communicate universal truths. So that's kind of the Plato part. Like, yes, it's useful as kind of a defensive art for juries and audiences to understand, for rhetors, right, to kind of guard against juries and audiences that might be lacking knowledge or uninformed. So the next question, is the rhetoric a techne? Now, there's not a fast and easy answer to this one. This is definitely more of a scholarly question, but I like to pose it to you all because this is the kind of work that we do as scholars. We think about, with the available information, we think about these questions, and we don't know if, obviously we know that the history shows that the handbook, the rhetoric was lost for a very long time, and then it resurfaced. So we don't know if it was distributed in any ways 100%. But so I'm gonna kind of go through 2 answers that talked about yes, it's a techne, and no, it's not. And again, there's not a correct answer here, but I think both of these individuals make great points. So Jennifer says, yes, I believe the rhetoric is a techne because it follows a systematic model of a handbook. He gives a concept or a topic, explains it in detail, then uses the examples to back up his explanation. To me, this read exactly like a techne or even today's textbook. Furthermore, we find the pieces broken down into section chapters. It is broken down into divisions. It has rules, right? Lastly, the point of view that he writes from should be considered. He's being direct and to the point. There are small excerpts from story just to give a further idea to the reader, but the piece is not telling a story. He is clear and concise in his writings and is sure to cover all he knows to cover on the subject. I think the style, content, and point of view in which he writes give us a clear idea that this is very likely a techne. I think those are all great points, Jennifer. Shayla says, no, I don't think it is. I think it could be used in that way, but it's not just a handbook or instruction manual. It's really more of a study of persuasion, how it's being used, how it's done, why it works. It's almost like a manual in behavioral science, right? Which is something that's really kind of awesome that we start to get in Aristotle. He gives us this sort of how audiences behave social and how a rhetor can treat an audience thing that we haven't really got up until this point. He conceives of the audience in a much bigger fashion. He covers everything, not just how to be an effective orator. He goes into logos, ethos, and pathos, which consists of how they are most used effectively and why someone would use them and why they would work. Aristotle also covers the non-technical modes of persuasion, such as laws, contracts, etc. It's all encompassing study of the art of rhetoric. Both of those are great answers. One of the questions that we could pose about a techne is, could someone write a speech from this? Again, the answers also would probably divide us. I do think that most of you all said, yeah, sure, it seems like a techne. But that's where more of the class is, but I think there's good arguments on both sides. What is the legacy of Aristotle? Kelly says Aristotle is a widely recognized name in the philosophy world, and usually is a go-for to introductions of rhetoric as well, most probably due to the credibility his name implies. In this work, we see echoes of his legacy in the early form of the rhetorical triangle. These are also mentioned directly on page 8, as well as remaining a common thread throughout the document. There's also an interesting nod to the difficulties of teasing apart ethics and natural sciences and vice versa, which is still a part of scientific advancement today and debate. His tips on managing audience are still part of public speaking coaching today, from choosing the right management of voices, of the voice to express the various emotions, and that's a quote, to refraining from poetry so as not to alienate the audience or sound ridiculous during a speech where plain prose is best for comprehension and receipt. The quote lines of proof in Book 2 are similar to lines of questioning and philosophical logic that exist in debate and even mathematical reasoning. Finally, his lines of argument through Book 2 bear a strong resemblance to the principles of logical fallacies of argument that are commonly taught today. So Kelly has a really great answer. Somebody in their last question asked about his legacy in philosophy. I think Kelly's answer kind of gives you a really good start there. Certainly, his work is much more extensive than just rhetoric, even though he taught a school of rhetoric in Plato's academy, or he taught rhetoric in the afternoon. So Sarah also had a good question, or a good answer. She said, in the English classes that she is shadowed in, the instructors teach students about the 3 different artistic proofs: ethos, logos, and pathos. And then she kind of goes through them. When viewing advertisement, for example, advertisers appeal to the consumer's logical, emotional, and or moral character. Now that we are entering election season, these 3 artistic proofs will be used to gain voter support as well. In addition to its artistic proofs, Aristotle's rational appeals have also penetrated themselves into the rules of argument we see today. The rational appeals of an enthymeme, reasoning in layman's term, maxim, and example are used today throughout speeches, law courts, etc. What I have described here concerning Aristotle's artistic proofs and rational appeals is only just a bit of how Aristotle's teaching have had an incredible influence today. Great points there as well. Aristotle is widely used in freshman composition. I think he gives a really systemic look. So like the Enlightenment thinkers really liked him because he grouped and categorized and put everything into this really big system. And so it gives kind of a scientific feel to what was always humanistic learning. Even though I don't know that I would necessarily place him as a super scientific thinker all the time, because still, again, like, universal truth is what he believes in. He's still on the side of Plato with that. But he does give us a lot more. So he's like Kant and thinkers like that are really down with Aristotle. So let's talk a little bit more about the things that you brought up. Nicolette said she was really surprised about how much she already knew about Aristotle without realizing it. And I would say that the Susan Jarrett piece that we read in the beginning of the semester, kind of where she's talking about reclaiming the sophists, because we've had a really Aristotelian an Aristotelian education beforehand. That's a good counterpoint to Aristotle. Like, of course you've been seeing this for all of your life. It's because modern education, rhetorical education, humanist, social sciencey stuff kind of comes up through Aristotle and the way that things are proved. Let's see. Somebody had a question about lying. A couple of you did. Like, Aristotle gives rhetoricians a lot of tools to persuade audiences, right? Who's to say that a rhetorician can't use these negatively and lie? And no one's to say that. Aristotle would not advocate for it. I think Isocrates, right, a couple weeks ago, that was one of the questions we got in discussion was, is it okay to lie with Isocrates? And there was a little bit of debate there. But in a lot of ways, Isocrates was really like, we do what's for the public's good. And so there's a question of it might be okay in Isocrates. Aristotle is definitely not advocating for it. And like I said before, rhetoric for him is only used when universal truth is not available. So it helps a rhetor build good proofs, right? Somebody who already is on the right side of truth. It's just helping them come up with better proofs. It helps them understand the audience better. So I don't know that I would say he advocates for lying. I think it's one of the more unfortunate, like this is where Plato creeps back in and would be like, yeah, this is why I think this is a dark art. This rhetoric stuff is because in the wrong hands, it could definitely be used poorly. And I think Jennifer asked something about Plato, like where he comes, like how he teaches under Plato. And some of you guys had this in discussion too. So by the end of the Phaedrus, Plato is less anti-rhetoric, and it's still not what we might call rhetoric, but Plato does. But it is one who knows who's leading the soul and one who doesn't. And that's the big thing with Plato, is that we want good leaders of the soul. And so his idea of a leader is a good moral leader, somebody who's leading the soul. And then Aristotle, I think, is up to educating audience and jurors and practitioners of rhetoric to kind of help out in these situations. So kind of a defensive art in the situations to help people with their souls, right? You all had really great discussions on the techne issue. I think you guys went back and forth, not one-upping, but most of you agreed that it was a techne. So when you discussed with each other, you were like, oh yeah, that's a great point too. So by the end, I think if I told you all as a class to write a collaborative project on if this is a techne, you all would have really good points about that. Somebody had a question about how he thinks about audiences differently, and the way that Aristotle, the examples that he gives are different ages, so how he conceives of a younger audience versus an older audience, and the question of appealing to diverse audiences. I think that also in his time, even though the people in the audiences, the people in the law courts, the people in the deliberative bodies, they're not exactly the most diverse, even though they're more diverse than they had been. So that the fact that Aristotle is dividing them between the young and the old really does mean something. Translating that to modern days, like you can see this in, if you've ever studied political speeches, the way that a politician might have to make different a claim that kind of resonates with an entire audience, and how difficult that can be in a diverse audience. Awesome. So that is all I have this week. Again, great work. Prepare yourself for Cicero, another dialogue, but definitely more complex than the Plato stuff. I find him pretty interesting, and he's kind of snarky, so you'll find some of that too, but he is difficult to get through on the first time. So have a great rest of your week. Thank you.